Good morning. My name is Gardner. I am professor and chair of the International Comparative Politics Department at the American University of Paris. I want to thank the NATO International School of Azerbaijan for inviting me to speak to you today on the present global crisis involving NATO and Russia. I apologize to you for not being able to be there in person, but when I woke up this morning, I found out that my plane was delayed by 2 to 3 hours because of the horrific terrorist attacks that took place in Istanbul airport. And I was concerned that I would not be able to make my flight to Baku and did not want to spend a day and night, if not longer, in the Istanbul airport stranded. But nevertheless, that subject of terrorism is in part a subject that concerns my discussion today on the vital issue of how to bring NATO and Russia back into closer cooperation so that we can create a new system of Euro-Atlantic security, much as was promised at the end of the Cold War when the Gorbachev and Bush senior administrations were beginning to talk about how to create a new system of security from Vancouver, Canada to Vladivostok, Russia. I believe that this system bring the Russians into a new relationship with NATO and the European Union is possible. We just have to begin to work at it now. And one of the first steps, in fact, towards working with a closer NATO-Russian relationship has just been taken by Turkish President Erdogan, Turkey, of course, being a NATO member, reaching out by apologizing to Russia for shooting down the Russian bomber that had strayed into Turkish airspace late last year. This letter expressed apologies for Turkish actions and expressed a willingness to work with Russia in the security area, as well as to end the mutual sanctions that both sides had placed upon one another. This, to me, is a statement, a move towards finding a way to bring Russia into a coalition against terrorism, against the so-called Islamic State and other organizations that are beginning to wreak havoc, not just in Istanbul, but in the Brussels airport, in Paris, or Orlando, where have you. So my point is that we need to bring Russia into a larger coalition, and I believe that this should be one of the themes of the NATO summit in Warsaw in July. So my first point here is to focus on how to do that. But before that, we need to explain why Russian and NATO relations have gone out of control, why we are at the real point of conflict. And believe me, we came close to war with the shooting down of the Russian jet by Turkey just late last year. But sometimes when two sides begin to really clash, both sides begin to realize and step back from that and begin to realize they need to make compromises and concessions. And that's precisely what I want to talk about today. One of those concessions, in my view, would be a neutral for the U.S. and Russia to formally recognize Ukraine as a neutral yet decentralized country, and for NATO to suspend its open enlargement policy. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But let me explain that we need to move towards a new relationship with Russia, and the more we simply talk about military buildup in the Baltic states or in Poland, the more the Russians will counter that. This will be a mutual buildup without end. What we need is positive suggestions that will entice and attract the Russians towards a new settlement. The NATO summit can't just pose threats, it needs to make proposals for peace. So how do we go about that? Well, my first point is to understand why this came about. If we don't understand the reasons why Putin engaged in what I call preclusive imperialism by seizing the Crimea and engaging in political military interference in the Donbass and the eastern Ukraine, we won't know how to resolve the crisis. So, and we need to work on different elements of the crisis. There's the NATO enlargement issue, there's the war on terrorism, and there's the ballistic missile defense issues as well, and tactical nuclear weapons. We can go down, there's a whole list of issues that have to be approached if we're ever to bring Russia into a closer relationship with NATO and the Europeans. But first, how do we get to this crisis? Well, I won't hide the fact that I believe that had we pursued the Partnership for Peace as thoroughly and as fully as we could have in the early 90s, I don't think we'd be in the present situation we are today. The Partnership for Peace was accepted by all states, including Russia. It was a way for states to find ways to cooperate. It was a way to develop peacekeeping forces in regional conflicts. It was truly a great concept that literally fell apart when NATO began to expand into Central and Eastern Europe. In 1993, Henry Kissinger, for example, called PFP, Partnership for Peace, the Partnership for Postponement of NATO Enlargement. The push for NATO enlargement really began with the U.S. Congress in 1992, pushing NATO to go past Eastern Germany once Germany unified, and then bring NATO into Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, with three states that basically encircled or protected Germany as a buffer at that time. And that was where some people thought NATO was going to stop. It didn't. It continued its expansion all the way to the Baltic states, which the Yeltsin, this is of course in 2004, under the Bush Jr. administration, but the Yeltsin administration had already warned that going to the Baltic states was a red line for Moscow. But even before 2004, there were signs of a backlash in Russia. And that backlash occurred basically in 1999 when President Putin came to power, though the militant side of it was a delayed reaction. It took until 2014 for the Russians to really react to NATO enlargement by the seizure of Crimea and interference in Ukraine. Well, what were the elements in 1999? First, I've already mentioned the expansion of NATO to Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. In addition to that, these states were brought into NATO at almost exactly the same time as the war over Kosovo. The Kosovo War angered Moscow because they saw it as directed by NATO without a UN mandate. The U.S. went out of the UN, and NATO engaged in a quote, an exceptional intervention. Well, Russia never took that as an exceptional intervention and saw this as illicit, illegal. Serbia was a close ally of Moscow, and therefore Russia found itself, NATO found that NATO was going around Russian interests, acting out of the UN Security Council, so therefore Russia had no power over it. In addition to NATO enlargement and the war over Kosovo, American Congress pushed the concept of missile defense deployments that would soon become what's happening now in Poland and Romania, where missile defense systems are being deployed. But that decision was pretty much supported back in 1999, before the U.S. went out of the ABM treaty in 2002 under Bush Jr. And that decision to go out of the ABM treaty in 2002 was a major mistake, in my view, without renegotiating the treaty with Moscow, because it opened the door to the ballistic missile race and a potential new arms race on the nuclear level. Well, get back to that, but the point is the missile defense systems were being talked about in 1999. In addition, in 1999, not only was the discussion of expanding NATO to the three Central European states, but also the idea of expanding NATO all the way to Ukraine, if not Georgia. So all these ideas, concepts, and pressures were already building up the tensions between NATO and Russia. President Putin was able to form a national security consensus against NATO enlargement at that time. But as I said, it took a kind of delayed reaction. The first reaction was perhaps the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. We can get into a real debate as to who started it, but nevertheless, both sides tended to provoke the other, and that war showed Russia that it needed to learn a lot more in order to rebuild its military capabilities, which it did do by 2014, and shown in the way that it was able to seize the Crimea, by the way, with forces that were already in the Crimea and that could be moved in quickly. The little green men that came in were already on the ground there. I think that's important for thinking about other possibilities of little green men showing up in Estonia or wherever. The fact is the Russian forces were already there. So the scenario wouldn't be the same if there's a problem in Estonia or in the other Baltic states that have large Russian communities. Well, we get back to my main point here is that the backlash was designed to prevent NATO from seizing the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, what Putin called NATO sailors. He was afraid that NATO sailors would appear, and political military influence in the Ukraine. Of course, Russia denies having any soldiers there. They're just volunteers. This was designed to block or NATO membership for Ukraine and permit Russia to maintain a political, economic influence inside Ukraine, to prevent Ukraine from eventually turning against Russia, as the Maidan movement had expressed its hope to get membership in both NATO and the European Union. Now, this is what I call preclusive imperialism. It's preclusive because Moscow was seeking to stop both the expansion of NATO and the European Union, and it's imperialism because it allows Russia to project power into the Black Sea, where it really couldn't. It was more limited when it was sharing Crimea, or sharing, it was allowed to have its Black Sea Fleet there, but there were still limitations under the Kharkiv agreements. Those limitations were eliminated once Russia seized the whole Crimea. Now, here, not only NATO was a problem, but the EU enlargement became a problem too. And this is also has to help explain the Russian backlash. In other words, European Union expansion was not an issue for Moscow until about 2008, when European Union proposed the Eastern Partnership with the former Soviet states from Belarus down into the Caucasus, of which Ukraine was the primary economic concern for Moscow. And this Eastern Partnership, Moscow feared, would shift the economies of these states away from Russian influence towards European influence, therefore isolating Russia. That is, if Russia did not also have an economic accord with European Union and Ukraine and the other states that would join this Eastern Partnership. So the Eastern Partnership was seen as isolating Russia economically. So this represented another factor that would lead Russia to intervene in the eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, in order to sustain its political and economic influence in that area and prevent it from being diverted towards the European Union. So this preclusive imperialism, as I said, is both preclusive to block NATO and the EU, but it's also imperialism because it allows Russia to project power even more extensively. And it's also, by the way, linked, seizure of Crimea is linked to protecting Russian influence abroad in Syria. Here, Russia is attempting to hold on to its what's left over of the former Soviet Union, hold on to its sphere of influence in Syria. And what's missing in many analysis is why do they want to hold on to Syria? Well, what's the issue there? Well, first is obviously to maintain their political interest and in Syria and in the general region. But it's also because Moscow fears that if Assad falls, Islamist regime will take its place, and this will backlash inside in the former Soviet Union itself, in the Muslim areas of the Russian Federation, and in the northern Caucasus, and generate more Islamist movements within the Russian Federation. So here, this is, I think, one of the main reasons, or one of the issues that's not being discussed as to whether or not to keep Assad in power or not. I actually think Assad could step down and at some point, and I don't think the Russians see him as a permanent fixture. In fact, at some points they did propose that he would leave power at some point. Anyway, get back to the main issue here is that Moscow is not it's acting defensively. It doesn't see itself as acting offensively, and the term aggression that's often used for really doesn't explain Russian behavior. My view is the term preclusive imperialism is a much better term, but it's preclusive, and because it's imperialism, it's also generating greater tensions between NATO and the Europeans, leading to a buildup of forces on both sides, in which Russia itself, seeing itself as the weaker power, is really trying to poke holes in NATO defenses, test by flying jets into NATO airspace, submarines into NATO airspace, and even into the space of neutral states like Finland and Sweden. So the point is that we're building what I call an insecurity dialectic, where insecurity creates a demand for greater security, and both sides begin to fight it out. And this leads us to how we to break this. How do we get to break this the tensions that are just building and spiraling out of control? And here, as I mentioned, Erdogan's proposal to apologize for shooting down the Russian fighter jet and to find ways to cooperate with Russia in the war on terrorism and with ISIS is a first step towards a rapprochement with Russia. Now, NATO has to do similar at the Warsaw Summit. It needs to say, we're willing to work with Moscow in creating a neutral yet decentralized Ukraine. We have trade agreements. The EU will have to work on this so that Russia, Ukraine, and Europe can find mutually beneficial trade relationships, so both sides do not feel totally excluded by the other. In addition, we have to end, or at least suspend, the open enlargement policy and begin to work towards building the partnership for peace and possibility of deployment of peacekeepers in the Donbass. Now, these peacekeepers can be under a UN or probably a OECE mandate in the case of Donbass, but peacekeepers could operate throughout the Donbass in order to provide the security conditions that will allow a political settlement to hold, creating, as I said, a neutral but decentralized Ukraine. But to do that, the Ukrainians have to begin their constitutional reforms, and the Russians will have to back off of the support for the autonomous movements. But this all has to be done as a process. It's not going to happen right now. But right now we do have a mutually hurting stalemate that can bring both sides, because both sides are not able to move forward. They should be able to compromise at this point. But my point is that these peacekeepers, the Partnership for Peace, should be one of the main items that the Warsaw Summit should talk about, because these peacekeepers could be deployed in the frozen conflicts in the Caucasus or in Syria, wherever they're needed. And this, I think, is so crucial to finding a political and peacekeeping solution to the issues that we're confronting today. Now, there's many other issues that need to be addressed, such as the reduction, if not the total elimination, of tactical nuclear weapons, some sort of joint NATO-Russia or U.S.-Russia missile defense systems where both sides operate systems mutually. These are some of the ideas that were proposed before but dropped out. And, of course, elimination of certain weapon systems, and or at least reduction of weapon systems in the long term. But these are the kind of things that NATO needs to propose and offer as incentives to bring Russia to the bargaining table so that we can end the hostilities and diffuse the crisis that we're walking into. Because the way we're going right now, it will be a permanent arms buildup without end, and we need to diffuse that by offering realistic objectives that both sides can agree to mutually. Thank you for your time and interest. I hope this can foster some debate. I'm sorry once again that I'm not there with you to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.